Okay. All right. Well, if everyone's comfortable, we might as well kick off. So, welcome all to this Harpers webinar. We've done a few now. This one, harnessing the crisis for change. Couldn't think of a more apt topic at the moment. So the aim today is to stimulate a panel discussion for around 45 minutes, and then throw open the debate to any questions from the audience, which our panel will endeavour to answer. On a quick housekeeping point, if you could use the Q&A function to write any questions to the panel, rather than chat, that would be good. And to cut down interference, we'll keep you, the audience, on silence throughout the session. So what are we going to discuss today? Well, against a backdrop of much noise about the new normal and how things will change, we've invited industry leaders to assess what ongoing changes can truly benefit both suppliers and the wider trade as we move through the evolving crisis and eventually into the post-pandemic world. Now, with margins already wafer thin for many ahead of the crisis, and on-trade suppliers and their accounts especially facing very tough trading conditions indeed, we're asking, can drinks trade businesses, what can they do individually and collectively to implement and drive forward a sustainable future as we sort of pass beyond the worst of the crisis? The headwinds, of course, are immense. We've just been discussing them a little earlier. Radically altered ways of operating and doing business, tied by social restrictions, with a massive recession mounting, and to cap it all, the fast approaching end of the Brexit transition, with much there still up in the air. That paints rather a gloomy picture, and I have to say a lot of it isn't that pretty out there, but it does suggest a massive catalyst for change. Question being whether the trade can grasp the proverbial nettle, and that's really what I want to discuss today. So, right, joining me today to pick our way through this are faces that will be familiar to most, if not all, of the attendees. And we've got some great people out there in the audience. I had a little scan through earlier as people were joining. We have Troy Christensen, CEO of Enotria & Co. Nick Darlington, director or co-director at Graft Wine Company. Michael Saunders, CEO of Bibendum, and Fergal Tynan, Chief Executive at Alliance Wines, and myself, Andrew Catchpole, editing Harpers Wine and Spirit, and my colleague Joe, last but far from least, our features editor at Harpers. Okay, so let's kick off. I think the first topic, under a loose heading of rechanneling resources, and I want to ask the panel, in the short to medium term, what aspects of lockdown enforced changes to the way the trade operates and does business? So, for example, things like travel, tastings, meetings, remote working and the rest of it, are likely to stick? And what are there any potential sort of savings and benefits to be had from these evolving and fast changing work practices at the moment? So, I don't know who would like to pick that up first. Perhaps, Michael, you're sitting sort of at the top of the list at the moment. You spoke last, so yeah.
Well, great. Well, it has been very different the last few months. I think everybody's aware, and I think some of the questions you've just asked are unanswerable because one simply doesn't know. I think a core ingredient of our world has been travel, for us to see our producers in situ and our producers to come here. You know, that feels a long way away right now with places like Melbourne going back into lockdown. So I think it's, you know, I can't imagine a world where we can do our job effectively for our customers not seeing our producers in situ. It doesn't seem real. Likewise, the idea of holding a big trade tasting where you have, you know, 50 plus people in the room sharing bottles, spitting, you know, in close contact also feels a long way away. And the mitigating factors of saving on some travel and some expenses don't get anywhere near that. Sorry, that's so typical. Don't get anywhere near making up for the current loss of revenue, because you know, I'm speaking for myself. It's, you know, obviously only a few days in, but you know, trade is nowhere near optimal, and I personally take the view it's going to take quite some time to come back. So I do think there will be change, but I couldn't honestly put my hand on my heart and tell you what change that will be. I don't think it'll stay as condensed as it is at the moment, but I don't think it'll go back to previous habits.
Yeah, does anyone else want to pick up on that? I mean, Nick, what thoughts?
I'd echo all of that. I mean, I can't see trade tastings, as Michael said, where you've got a room of people spitting and walking around freely. I can't see that happening for a very, very long time, probably until there's a vaccine. I can see maybe tastings happening. In fact, tastings are happening in very limited ways. I saw a little bit over social media in the last couple of days of something happening. When that's just a few people in a room all spaced apart, tasting very targetedly for specific reasons. Maybe it's a competition, those kind of things I can see happening, judging, stuff like that. But any one of us here today, and I mean, fellow panelists host much bigger tastings, trade tastings for customers than we do at Graft, or I ever had in the past at Red Squirrel. We all, I think, appreciate that there's no way those will ever happen under the current circumstances. So you have to try and adapt how you market yourself to customers and how you show your wares to customers in this new era. But I think for the most part, we haven't really reached that point. We've got to wait to see what the autumn tasting season looks like, whether anything will be possible. So in some ways, this has come at quite a good time for the industry, purely from a trade tasting point of view, because it gives us it buys us some time until those big periods come into play. But in terms of travel, people won't be traveling around, but at the same time, the fact they're not traveling around is bad for the industry. Whether we're saving money, whether there's saving graces and being able to put winemakers in front of people virtually in a way that it was harder because they had to travel. So I'm talking now in the opposite direction to what Michael's just said about going to see your producers, which is of course essential to be a good wine importer and being able to travel and see where the wine comes from. But in reverse, our customers often don't get a chance to see the small producers because they maybe can't afford the time or the resources to travel anyway. So there's a benefit in that, but the fact that people aren't traveling is bad for all of us in the industry, because travel, whether it's us doing it or it's business people, tourists around the world, is inherent to the success of a lot of businesses that we work with. So where the savings are, I echo what Michael said, they're never going to stack up against what we lost through all that.
So Troy, I mean, when we last met, slightly sunnier climes, at Stag's Leap on a trip over in Napa for a conference there. That kind of essential kind of meeting, seeing your supplier, the producer, going out, seeing accounts, etc., etc. Is there going to be a sort of, how are you looking to evolve the balance of that with, sort of the technology that's available like this, etc.?
Well, so that's a good question. I think what's happened, what was impossible before is now becoming a bit normal, and I think that might stay for a little while. So we always had to go out, right? It was always an enjoyable trip to go out and visit and see and get a feeling of the land. And I think there's a lot of people now trying to find ways and innovations to get around this. We took an opportunity. We have about 85 to 90% of our business is on trade. We have a small off trade, but we also have a retail and the digital, like everybody's digital platform, sort of went into hyper growth. And so we sort of had a limited group of people working, and we were trying to find ways to leverage the platforms with each other. So we would put together a 6-pack from a notable wine producer. We would market it, sell it on a Monday, and then have people in an Insta Live tasting where we would connect that winemaker from Sicily, from France, from Chile, into a Insta Live tasting, so you could talk about it with a little bit of a mix of trade and consumer in there, and then follow up a little bit later with the people that were interested in getting additional tidbits of information to them. So I do think the trade is going to have to think about, and I agree with Nick, this is a bit of a long-term situation where we're not going to revert back immediately to the way it was. And I think that's also a little bit of the challenge as we bring some people off furlough now that they're still, despite being locked down, there's almost sense from many in the industry or trade that, oh, great, I get to go back and do all the things that I used to do. And you can't. You got to work from home. You're calling your people, to like this, to go through whatever product you're shipping it to them and doing it virtually. So I think there is a lot of what is happening now that needs to evolve a little bit, but it will become part and parcel of the trade in the future more than flying around and doing the stuff that we did in the past.
Yeah, well, what about that element that I think you and Nick touched on, probably Michael as well, that you can actually bring a producer right in front of a consumer, or indeed of the people on the shop floor or the restaurant floor, bar floor, etc. It's kind of awoken our eyes, hasn't it? Communication like this to the ways that, I mean, for us, it's been really interesting because I hosted a round table effectively for independent merchants a while back, and it took out all of the complications and cost of people traveling from Scotland and from Cornwall, etc., etc. So, and found that, you know, it was very, very easy to get people collectively together. And while it's obviously not like that very personal contact, if you've made that personal contact in the past, there is some kind of a carry through, isn't there, in terms of the, you know, the relationship going forward. So you can top up much more easily like this. So there are surely flexibilities there. I mean, Fergal, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think for us, probably a lot of the short-term, the Zoom meetings and the travel and all of that will stay, I think, but gradually the costs will return. It's still a people business, as everybody has said, and I think there's no substitute for that ultimately. But I guess probably one of the biggest things reflecting on it, just hearing all of that, was that with the trade closed down for 4 months, I think pretty much everybody in the company spent a lot more time engaging directly with consumers to maybe a greater extent than has been the case for the last 10 or 15 years. And if that continues, it could be a very positive thing for the trade, because I think under the pressure of the last 10 years, we've maybe been quite inward looking. And I think compared to a number of categories, spirits and stuff that have maybe had bigger budgets and been more engaged at a consumer level compared to the glory days of 80s primetime TV when wine was the star of Saturday evenings, that could, and I think if we can keep that up as an industry, we'll be a lot better for it if we can get wine. But trying to find them, certainly technology, Zoom, all of those things have made it a lot easier to reach consumers. I think everybody's been doing it. Whether that was a conscious move, probably not. But if we can harness that, could be a positive thing. I think we certainly need it. That'll be the subject of the conversation later. But that direct access to consumers, particularly in a non-producing country, is a very positive thing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this sort of thing is very, very far from going to sort of save the trade, as it were. But so I'm interested, looking ahead. I've popped down a heading: getting profitable, with the crisis bringing to a head the unsustainable finances of hospitality and some of its suppliers, very precarious financial situation it's usually in anyway. What can change? What needs to be changed so the economics of both supply and demand side of the equation? What can be improved? How looking forward? It's a bit of an old chestnut because it's something we've discussed before on various panels with the trade, but surely that's now at a sort of really sort of intense kind of place in people's minds with all the pressures that are on the drinks business that we've just talked about. Are there just certain key things going ahead that simply must now change within the way that the trade is sort of structured?
Well, I'll kick off because Roy and I were on a call this morning actually, which highlighted, the current crisis is not the only crisis, and you mentioned it earlier in terms of the issues coming in around Brexit, which I don't think the trade is alert to yet. And for anybody on this webinar who's not aware of what's coming down the track, I'd urge you to contact the WSTA and give us, have a cold drink in your hand while you do that, because it's not very pleasant. So, my personal view is things will change, because where the direction of travel at the moment is totally unsustainable. And, finding a way to work that's commercially viable, both politically, legally, and in our own world of our own trade is going to be absolutely fundamental. And we've talked about it for years, but the competitive pressures in the market keep everybody in the space where there is stress in the system. And, in one sense, that's quite healthy. But to me, and I think sort of Fergal sort of touched on it latterly, I mean, I think the key thing that the wine trade holistically, and and I'm obviously part of that, where we failed is to take enough consumers with us on the interest journeys, so they actually buy wines that are that have value for everybody in the supply chain, not just the person importing and selling. So we just have failed comprehensively. And if you look at what most people are drinking most of the time, to me it's not surprising that we're losing quite a lot of young people to other categories where there's more excitement, entertainment, visuals. And I think it's at our own behest to solve. But I mean, I just think we are staring into just a very large number of big issues, and I'm not sure an hour can justify the number of things we can do. But basically, to me, we've got to find ways collectively and individually to bring the consumer with us on into the world that we all, everybody probably on this call absolutely loves, and I just don't think we've succeeded.
That's okay. The key thing there, because the word collectively is certainly an interesting one, but at the same time, you are all rivals fighting for share of a very, very tough market, and your first responsibility is to your own company, to any shareholders, etc. So it's how then could you come together collectively? I mean, could we
just to jump in once more, my first thing, and this is wearing a WSGA hat, is collectively we've got to write to the government. We've got to make them understand what they're about to do to our industry. After that, then I think it's sort of every person for themselves and their own business. But we have got to work collectively on the big structural legal issues right now.
Yeah, and I mean, having taken on board what's coming down the tracks potentially with a messy end transition, Brexit transition, I'd echo what Michael's saying. But does anyone else want to pick up specifically on how to bring how to change the relationship with the customer?
If I could interject, I think strangely enough, there was a dynamic going on in the casual dining sector in particular, where people were just going into, the Deliveroo, the on-demand. And so there was a significant shift of the consumer already for it. There wasn't a lot of beverage alcohol options, through the Deliveroo model necessarily, but overnight in particular from the Amazons, et cetera. I do think that interestingly, and the numbers are sort of proving this out, that the lockdown increased the share of throat of wine, and actually provides it a bit of an opportunity because people are at home. There's no sports, so you're not drinking beer. I know some people who are outside and running around. And particularly in the UK, there isn't necessarily as much of an at-home cocktail culture, maybe a gin and tonic, but you're getting used to this, going to the bar and having a very fancy, perfect serve of a gin and tonic with all sorts of, entertainment around the making of the cocktail. You're not going to do that at home. And so wine in particular, and anecdotally, everybody that I had talked to, they sit around with their family, they're locked in, and they open up wine more than they ever did. And I think that, to Michael's point, it's now our challenge to try to, leverage a little bit of that benefit. And some of the CGA numbers that came out have said there's an overall decline, but the decline in the wine category is less than any other category out there right now, at least in the UK. And in the US, it actually increased more than in any of the other categories. And so I think, strangely, there was a little bit of a maybe a silver lining in the cloud here, if we can take advantage of it. But to your point, and the challenge of the industry is there's always this tough competitive side. So if we go back slugging at each other and ripping margin out of the value chain and ignoring the consumer, then we're going to lose again to the spirits and beer guys. So let's take this little bit of an uptick in category benefit to a very difficult situation, see if we can make the most of it.
Yeah. Nick, yes.
I mean, there is a lot to be said here, of course, and profitability in the wine industry is, well, it's not restricted to the wine industry. We talk about how other drinks categories have maybe done better at engaging consumers, but you only have to look at the difficulties that a lot of breweries, big and small, are having in this country in the beer market at the moment, and show that there's a lack of profitability even there, whereas craft beer does a infinitely better job at appealing to consumers than wine does. So it is not restricted to wine, but the wine supply chain, I think, particularly in the on-trade, which everyone here is to a greater or lesser extent focusing on, is a real problem. And I think it starts at source. It starts at the on-trade. I mean, even before lockdown, this has brought to a head how unsustainable the finances of most of our hospitality trade can be. And that's at every link in the chain. Many businesses were barely breaking even before the need to contemplate reducing capacity. And that's a supply side and a demand side problem. The supply side economics of it are where the solution is. Running a restaurant, especially in urban centres, which are likely to be very quiet for a long time, those economics have hit a brick wall. rents are too high, rates are too high, suppliers get squeezed in all manner of ways, and too much margin is sacrificed at every stage in the chain. And then on the demand side, the public needs to readjust to maybe paying more. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen, because you're always going to have people offering less. So the solution to this starts at a market correction. And that's a market correction in terms of, I guess, the supply side economics of running a restaurant. Big parts of that are the taxation regime and the rents. Now, the rents might correct themselves, because a lot of restaurants are going to go bust. They will have to vacate premises. Landlords will either have to reduce their rents or be sat with empty units. And we'll see that in, I think, urban centres in particular over the next however many months, as long as this goes on, if there isn't that market correction. And this idea of a rent pause is great. And of course, I support that. But it kicks this greater structural problem down the road, which is it is unsustainable to be able to offer the kind of price, food at the kind of prices, drinks at the kind of prices that consumers are used to, but in the prevailing economic model. So there has to be that market correction to improve profitability. And the idea then, of course, is it filters down the chain so that, you know, the likes of ourselves can engage in a healthy competition, but all still making a decent living and being able to pay staff and be able to grow and make wine an interesting category. Or it keeps going in reverse, where I think it was Troy or Mike, I can't remember who it says, but, you know, where every day is almost, you know, a struggle to fight for more and more share or more and more margin. And that's where I see the solution. It's a whole scale market correction.
So if we rewind to, if anyone wants to chip in on this, the financial crisis, sort of 07, 08, did we see much change coming out of that in the longer term?
Not much positive change, I think.
That's really easy. Yeah, Fergal, did we see a kind of a correction that led to perhaps fewer operators, more consolidation, but any greater sort of margin or wriggle room in the?
No, I think sadly quite the opposite. Probably from that one, in terms of values got thrown out the window. There was an interest in organic wine beforehand that disappeared overnight. Margins got squeezed, and everybody reacted by doing what they normally do, which is say, I need to make savings, and therefore I need to get my costs down, which is a line that you can take for a while, but you eventually reach the end of that road. And I think most of the people here would probably concur that we're fairly close to the end of that road in terms of cutting costs out of our side of it. Most people, I think, probably seen their turnovers, some of the people here, triple or quadruple over the last decade, but I would be surprised if their profits have done anything better than stayed where they were 10 years ago. So I think that's been a conundrum. There are a lot of structural external things you can look at and hope for, but I think there's still quite a lot we can do internally. Just reflecting, one of the greatest strengths of the business is passion. Pretty much everybody gets into it because they love it as a business. It's a very social business, but that's also been its biggest weakness. I think too many people in the on-trade as well get into it because they love it. They love food. They love the social side of it. And I think we're probably all guilty of sacrificing an awful lot of business common sense to just our passion for the industry generally. And the number of meetings we have, even with on-trade generally, where we review business rather than just look at wines, and the amount of conversations that should happen about how we can all make more money, how we can cut down on the number of deliveries per week, how we can change wine lists to make them work better. There's still too much just about wine and personal relationships and enjoying it, which, as I said, I'm certainly not proposing that we lose that. But I think probably the balance is one of the things that we can control, and it would be great talking about, while we're all in competition, one of the things that we're not in competition with, and there's still, I think, the generic bodies, the WSTA has been great, and it's really highlighted the need for those kind of organizations for us, but there probably still aren't the forums for the different levels of the trade to get together. I don't spend enough time talking to restaurant organizations, and it's certainly made it abundantly clear that I don't spend enough time talking to politicians who control an awful lot of what we do through taxation, but understand very little about the direct implications of it. So I do think the kind of the communication across the industry, both in terms of working more closely with people as a supply chain, but also being much more engaged at a kind of, I was reading the government announcement yesterday, hospitality employs 8% of the workforce. And I think, I know when we all had to call HMRC in March asking for extensions on the duty that was coming in, it was suddenly brought clear that actually our main occupation seems to be that of tax collector. And I think given our power as tax collectors and the fact that as an industry we employ 8% of the workforce, we actually have relatively little interaction, I would say, and relatively little leverage compared to many other industries of a fraction of that scale. So there's a challenge there for us all. And I think the WSTA have risen to that challenge really admirably. It's been very strong and a really useful anchor for everyone. But there's, I think, a lot more that we could do and need to do.
Sorry, if I can just chip in, because somebody's also asked about the VAT reduction yesterday, the measures that were brought in. Because I know, obviously, Nick, you were talking about market, economics and structural change for the long term. Is there anything that's kind of coming out that came out yesterday that's maybe a signal of positive change, or maybe that is a catalyst for something that could be taken forward long term? Do you think the VAT reduction will help?
No, I don't. I think I've said this before it was announced. I think the VAT reduction is a complete red herring. It's not going to encourage anyone who wasn't going to go to a restaurant to go to a restaurant. My advice to any restaurant owner would be just leave your prices where they are, pocket the extra margin because you're going to need it. For us as a drinks industry, it obviously doesn't make any difference because it doesn't apply to alcohol. But again, I think that's the right thing. No sane government in this day and age can be seen to be subsidizing alcohol consumption during a pandemic. That's just a fact of life, sadly. So the VAT aside, which I think if managed correctly by restaurants and so forth should help their finances. I think that there were some good measures. I don't quite understand how the voucher system is going to work for restaurants. I think that might actually involve more costs than the politicians quite envisage for the businesses to administer. And then, some of the higher end establishments that, those around this call might be working with probably won't bother to some extent, because the proportion of their bill at a 1 Michelin star restaurant, or not even that extent, is going to be relatively small. I think that what was spoken about yesterday was more important, was about the less headline grabbing measures around jobs and training, and making sure that in the shake up that this industry, but other industries are going to go through, that there are opportunities for people to retrain, be supported as they have to move through different layers of employment, because there is going to be a natural shake-up. So I thought there were some good things done, and generally I think that from that economic side, the Chancellor has largely done a great job. But I think that some of the aspects yesterday are a little bit misguided.
It's interesting, I think, what you were saying, Nick, about the way that a government isn't going to sort of heavily promote increased alcohol consumption or push that. But if you look at what was announced yesterday, for example, things happening on the food front, I always feel that the wine and broader drinks side of it is the sort of silent partner in the on-trade, in the sense that it's not highlighted in anything like as much as the foods. And it would be the same for national critics, half of whom never mentioned the drinks list in restaurants. And is that something that the trade can sort of leverage more or shout about more? Because that kind of imbalance, I mean, if you look at the profits that come from wet sales as opposed to the food side of things, it's very, very, very significant, isn't it, for outlets? And it's something that just doesn't seem to enter into the public or political kind of consciousness as much as the food side of it. People think restaurants, they think food, whereas half of the bill typically, well, mine usually will be wine.
Well, that's a great point. That's partly why I don't think it's going to encourage a spike in demand, because people know that if they go out for a nice meal, a big chunk of their bill isn't going to be subsidised or reduced anyway, because it's the booze. So they'll be paying the same amount for the alcohol. They might get a bit of money off for the food. The restaurant might pass that on, I don't know. But it's not going to make a great deal of difference. I do think, though, that if restaurants pocket that extra margin, that will go a long way to helping the sector. And in some ways, that's actually depends how you interpret the Chancellor's announcement. He did allude to the fact that this would help the finances of the industry. So it wasn't altogether the way the Germans did it a few months ago was, we are cutting VAT to stimulate demand. That was a very deliberate goal. The goal yesterday was a bit more nuanced, which is we want to stimulate demand, but equally we want to put money in the pockets of these restaurants because they're going to need it at 45% capacity like they were at the weekend just gone. So I think that is positive, but it's open to interpretation.
Anyone else like to pick up on that, actually, while this is such kind of relevant and immediate news and change? The Chancellor's measures, Troy? Yeah.
Yeah, so, I don't think it's not going to hurt per se, but I agree with Nick. It's not a panacea as well. I think it's good that the Chancellor recognizes the importance of the industry, not just, I think, in economic terms, but in terms of, the importance of night economy to, the big cities. But in countries that have opened up, as Nick alluded to earlier, people are avoiding the big cities. Rome is dead, Milan's dead, but all the little, places out are the small little cities are doing pretty good business. And I think that's going to happen here in London as well, where you do get this difference between people not going to work. A lot of people aren't going to go back to work for the next 6 months. The people in London that basically, sold, coffee in the morning, lunch, or a day after work drink are really going to struggle. So, I think it's good that they're trying to do some things to help the industry, the importance of trade. It's difficult, I think, to come up with something, that is going to drive demand immediately. I think the UK government in particular was very strong in the messaging around not going outside. And so, you still saw 52% of the people thought that hospitality was opened too early. So I think until that demand naturally comes, any financial incentive is going to be pretty difficult. The one real wine-related aspect of it, if the direct-to-consumer trade gets much more important, and this pressure's been coming on for a while, the way that the restaurateurs mark up wine is pretty ridiculous. And now, people that liked a particular bottle of wine that suddenly, started looking for it, online somewhere and realizing that they were paying 3 times more than that in the restaurant, I think are really going to struggle to go back to that restaurant and pay that restaurant price. And a lot of people have really wanted to get their product into the consumer's hands during a period when the restaurants were shut. And so you did see a lot of digital growth and even with our numbers and just talking to other off-trade customers, there was this typical split. A lot of people absolutely trading down, but there was a lot of people trading up. As someone that probably spent £300 for a bottle of wine happily will spend £100 for that same bottle a couple times over. So actually our high-end wine did pretty well during the lockdown period.
Actually, this kind of relates to something that we were looking at this morning, just about the rise of what you would call ghost kitchens or virtual restaurants that exist primarily online, and people moving more towards obviously being at home and wanting things on demand. But I think Euromonitor this morning were reporting ghost kitchens could be worth $1 trillion globally by 2030, which just obviously shows you how quickly that's moving. And where wine and spirits sits in that as well. So we've got restaurants that are purely online with a brand and they're sort of stand alone on their own. But where the drinks offering will sit in with that.
Well, there's a couple of people doing that. We supply one. He saw his sales increase 5% in a month. And if you look to the States, there's a group called Drizzly, and they basically are the Deliveroo of wine that basically deliver sort of that 1 hour on demand, and Amazon's moving into that kind of arena as well. Mm-hmm. So I do think there is this shift that's going to happen that this period just, exacerbated the people that happily sat at home and watched Netflix and ordered Deliveroo. But they're really, because of the dynamic of wine in particular, you saw, the Carluccios of the world and the people that are selling 12 to 15 pound, boxes of noodles. they still want to charge £30 for a bottle of wine that, you know, Pinot Grigio that you can buy, you know, over here at Ocado at, you know, £5 to £6 and get it delivered overnight. So I think there is going to be a big push and a lot of innovation in that channel that is going to compete directly against the on-trade.
And as you say, wine travel as well, as opposed to cocktails, which is still finding its feet at home. And I think what we've seen overall is that for the overall consumption has gone down if you take out the on-trade, but actually wine has done pretty well as a result. And there's been more wine overall being drunk. Obviously, spirits, we obviously all have an invested interest in spirits as well, but particularly wine we're talking about, yeah.
Sorry, Joe. Yeah,
sorry, I was just going to say, I think we've got one more question coming in. No, I think the same, but just to say to everybody out there, do send us some questions and we're happy to answer them.
Yeah, no, very, very much. And I think, but Joe, just picking up on what you and Troy were saying there, it sort of leads into another topic I wanted to cover, namely agility and embracing sort of more fluid sort of sales channels or approach to market or markets. So obviously we've seen an awful lot of fluidity in terms of business adaptation and people flipping over, as alluded to earlier, kind of, you know, direct to consumer and so on. In the past, there's been a lot of talking about strict channel management. This one seems like the complete opposite. And I understand that there may be sort of clashes and grey areas and difficulties thrown up by this. But does anyone want to come in on how much of that fluidity may be a good thing going forward? How much that may remain? Or do you think everything will, as we approach more of a normal trading situation down the line, things will lock back in and slot into place where they sat? Are we going to see more agility, more flexibility and fluidity?
I think one thing I hope we see is the continued flourishing of the independent wine merchant sector, because that's been an area that, you know, I've wanted, you know, have supported for a long time, because I think it's a vital part of the trade's DNA here, which goes back to what I was talking about earlier. So if relationships have been formed between the consumer and a really good local independent, I think that's incredibly healthy for the medium term of the wine and spirits industry, actually. If that is a legacy of the current environment, you know, great.
You know,
does anyone else want to pitch in? Nick, you're nodding.
I think they all need a holiday. Sorry. I think anybody who owns an independent probably hasn't slept much for the last 4 months. The memorable phrase that it was like a sinister Christmas that just kept on happening. Yeah, it's been a boom time for the indies. I think the kind of creativity and energy there meant that they reacted. And I think a lot of the move to online, which was probably overdue and one of the biggest weaknesses in that sector generally going forward, has been addressed in a very short space of time. So I think, as well as all of the additional kind of contacts and local customers, that sector is in great shape, which is fantastic.
It's interesting, just some figures we put out today from I think it was the Capgemini index on our newsfeed, looking at June. So May, big jump again on online beer, wine, spirit sales, BWS. But even with more independent stores open, it's sort of continued to rise, not quite as fast, but it's looking very much like there are enough people out there now who have been trained, much more trained, to sort of shop online, to use online platforms and so on. So that seems pretty ingrained. So I can't imagine that going away anytime soon, actually.
One of the things that we thought too is a lot of people that were trading directly to the on-trade food customers, you know, they had no option, and everybody's created their own Shopify site and they're going directly to the consumer. And actually some people are getting some volume. So a fruit and veg distributor actually engaged us, got, you know, some cases of wine, and they were doing, you know, 40 to 60 cases every other week. And you just see a lot of those, and it feels like people are trying to diversify. And so some of the areas of growth are going to be areas that we haven't seen before. And it isn't just the independent trader, but it is, you know, the steak guy that was, you know, selling steak to or meat to the on-trade. There's lots of fish people, and we've engaged with them. We've helped them get alcohol licenses. So we went and secured an individual and we basically put him on contract, and he's been doing alcohol licenses for all these people that have shifted into the, direct to consumer. And, they want a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc and, Pinot Grigio, Malbec, some of the standards. They're not going to get, too adventurous, but, if someone can, likes getting their fruit and veg and it can come with a bottle of Prosecco, they're going to be all over it. So I do think you're going to see some of these probably not overtake other channels, but, it's going to eat away at a bit of share.
Yeah, no, sure.
The elephant in the room, which I think is what your question or your topic was aimed at, really, Andrew, is the controversy around large on-trade wine suppliers setting up direct-to-consumer models. And the controversy by that stemming from the independent sector, which has done very well, as people have alluded to in the last few months. I mean, the number one response to that is, firstly, that there is absolutely nothing new with big on-trade wine suppliers having direct-to-consumer arms. I mean, Troy alluded to earlier, Enotria & Co. has one. I mean, which is now less of a separation in some ways than it was before, and has become more important. We've always had one. I mean, if you take the top 50 wholesalers that Harpers put together last year, over 50% of that top 50 list are big wholesalers with retail arms, either very explicit or less explicit, but still existing. So I think that there has been appreciation that if there has been a vast switch in supply channel, out of necessity because people's customer base has disappeared overnight, then that is absolutely nothing new. So if there's any controversy around it, then it's misplaced because it's existed forever. And I do think that for the most part, it is to stay. Some suppliers will say that that's not for me, and they want to stay completely trade focused. Some might want to keep what they've launched in the last few months. And I think the trade needs to wake up to the fact that there's nothing necessarily either new or wrong with that. We just need to have maybe a better appreciation of channel management and how that works. And as long as everyone's open and transparent about it, then it works very fine. If you take the beer industry, for instance, as a comparison. Now, a quality little independent beer merchant would not be seen dead with Carlsberg on their shelves, but they will quite happily have a big brand like Beavertown or Brewdog, which you'll also find in Sainsbury's, in as much as you will a small quirky little independent beer merchant. Now, beer seems to have a much more fluid and democratic approach to those kind of supply channels. I'm not saying wine's going to get to that point, but I think that there will, coming out of this, be a better understanding and flexibility around those supply chains. And that, I think, is an innovation that is here to stay.
Does anyone want to pitch in on that? Anyone back that up or feel that's...
Well, if I could, because we do have a pretty large digital, and we're actually going to go further down the path in the very near term, because we think you have to diversify the risk. It is about also channel management and getting the right products in the right places. Look, I'm sitting on a surplus amount of inventory, and you're trying to clear some stock, so it's a nice way to get some product out there. But my God, if I discounted under what some other indie I've sold it to, I find out about it quite quickly via email or someone screaming. So I do think, though, it's also helpful for us to engage with the consumer. So we're also talking about the consumer, and there's a whole new way to do it. And I think wine is a little bit behind when it comes to the Instagrams, and I think Michael had referred to the other guys with the big budgets. But quite frankly, you don't need the kind of budget you did in trying to get that TV ad on 1980s TV, as Fergal mentioned. You can actually do, and everybody's doing, the kinds of things that will draw some attention. So I do think actually it's a bit here to stay. I think a lot of people get into it, and hopefully it helps really develop and drive a little bit more of that consumer engagement that I think we as a category are desperate.
Well, I'm flip side of that coin, because I don't have a B2C business. I sold that back in 2013 or something, and we've taken the line of working strongly via the independents through our Walker Woodhouse division, where we also do what Troy just said, try and get good interaction with the final consumer through our customers. So I think there are a variety of different ways of doing it, and I'm not, that's just the way we've chosen to do it, and others do it differently.
Yeah.
Just coming back to Troy's point about reaching people through social media, that actually kind of segs quite nicely to a question we've got here about having a captive audience at home. Somebody's asked the question, is this an opportunity for perhaps engage consumers in completing a WSET course and maybe converting occasional drinkers into regular wine consumers by reaching them through various methods at home? Do you see that as an opportunity?
Well, now, interestingly, because I'm on the WSET board, and the WSET is a great organization that does great things for the industry and the trade, but its entire business model was to bring a bunch of people together in a room to train them and to spit wine and taste wine. And they have done a great job quickly flipping into a digital model. So they are launching a whole series of online courses, and they've got the wines that'll come out. So again, I think, you know, that would be an example of a business that was successful, that helped and supported our industry and really adapted so quickly. And their percentage completely flipped over from schooling to online training. And because everybody was home, there was a spike in demand for all the lockdown countries because of it. And they responded quite quickly to it. So they've done a really good job. And maybe, you know, because this becomes a little bit more of a common thing, being able to order wine immediately, have it show up, and then have someone teach you about it. You know, again, I think it could be helpful for the industry if we all support these kinds of endeavors.
Mm.
So we had, that's interesting. And the question actually, I think, came from Ian Harris, who obviously heads up WSET, but also then asks if the panel sees this as an opportunity. And by that, I'm reading that as going back to what we were saying about consumers at home, often spending up because they're not actually going out and spending on trade prices. But whether there's a greater, we sort of touched on this a little bit, but whether there's a greater opportunity and a broader opportunity, perhaps even beyond WSET education, to engage with those consumers while they're having more time at home, while perhaps they're, you know, we've all got a little more time on our hands if we're not commuting, no matter the hours that some of us are all putting in work-wise to cover for those who are sort of furloughed, etc. So is that something that could be broadened out? I mean, Troy, yes, straightforwardly on the education front of what the WSET is doing a good job, but
well, look, I think when people were locked at home, it was really easy to get them. You saw it with our Instagram live tastings. As soon as they have other alternatives, it tempers off a little bit now that people are you know, getting out. So I think we almost were a little over enthused that our mild content could initially drive such significant interest. And I guess the alternative was watching some, you know, rerun on Netflix. And so I think, you know, the challenge for us now is we've got them a little bit engaged. They've tried it. They've been somewhat happy about it. But now how do you turn it into something that you can continue? I mean, sort of the Zoom pub quizzes went crazy, then they just all stopped. So I'm not sure anyone's doing them anymore. So I think it does take, when there's that alternative, you got to compete with that alternative. And you know, there are some really passionate wine interested folks. I think a lot of times, because we try to get too tradey, the kind of technical content and things that we're providing wasn't as interesting as the winemaker telling the stories, which we know sells so much of the brand and the product. So, you know, so frequently we're even approaching the B2C channel with our B2B hats on. And I think that's something that has to shift quite quickly, that we're actually telling and providing content at the level of the consumer, not the gatekeeper that has a different level of question. And so, you know, you just have to switch these hats, and we're finding that it is a bit of a challenge, but I think we as an industry have to rise to that challenge.
Yeah. We've got a couple more questions coming in, but does anyone want to add to that? Well, who's looking keen? I'll pick on you, Nick, shall I? You're looking.
Well, I would say experience was quite similar to what Troy just said, which was those first few weeks of lockdown where people were literally locked down were extraordinary. I mean, I'm putting aside the sort of slight PTSD I think a lot of people were going through. There was something happening almost every single night, and it became a mixture of really amateur and sometimes quite bad attempts to engage, but also some really quite exciting moments of engagement, whether it's other side of the world or people in the same country. And I found it quite stimulating. I really, really did. We were watching or taking part or leading things. That has disappeared. There's still opportunities to do it, but I think that it's now no longer, I am opening a bottle of wine and therefore I must tell Instagram live right now, set up the camera, here we go, because if I miss this opportunity, who knows when the next one will come. There's less of that. So it's less spontaneous than it was. And I think therefore it's getting better. A lot of these things we started doing 3 months ago, we started doing in a slight panic, thinking, well, I've got to do something. And this will only be for a few months because that's what the government's saying and that's what I'm telling myself. But we're now realizing this is here to stay, maybe not just for a few months, but maybe even for a couple of years. And we are therefore becoming more professional about it. And we are thinking more long-term about how do we do this properly. And as Troy alluded to, if you have a B2C arm, then you don't talk to your customers, you're with a C, in the way that you would talk to your sommeliers, for instance. And that's starting to inform a lot more what we're doing.
Yeah. So sort of a tidying up and a polishing, a less reactive approach, and more actually looking, I think as we were saying earlier, and kind of looking at how you want to shape some of these tools and differing, evolving channels, etc., to your future as a company and to the trade, as opposed to just sort of running to keep up, which I think everyone obviously was doing to begin with. So I've got a couple of questions, not entirely, but related to sort of topics that we've passed through just a short while ago. Just take them from the top. Sophie Jump's asking about how you reach a consumer unless you already have a database, i.e. how to create online visibility. Do you want to?
I could jump in on that quite quickly and say that because we always had our redsquirrelwine.com online shop, and that's how the company started. It was there, and we just pressed go. I mean, it existed. I think other companies that had it found the first few weeks of lockdown relatively straightforward. I think a lot of the particularly on-trade focused suppliers who suddenly, literally, rapidly set up a website found that a bit difficult, and they were talking to their trade customers anyway. And the way they got a bit more influence and awareness was going to the press. And therefore you saw some people being written up in the newspapers as these people are now delivering and things, and that maybe helped. But I think if you already had a consumer presence, it was a lot easier. So in a roundabout way, I agree with Sophie that it's very, very difficult if you don't already have that presence, because they're very different markets.
Yeah, okay. One more question, which I think is an interesting one, from Vivian Gabe, asking about, do the panelists see events like Provine taking place next year? But I suppose that could go with anything, and we just popped up a little story today about Little for Spain. Wines from Spain trade tasting is now not going to take place on the newly revised 29th of September. And I think anything of that size is impossible to see happening for quite a while. But what thoughts as to what size tastings, how quickly, how can that side of the trade begin to kind of reopen? I mean, Michael, I suppose you kicked off with talking about the importance.
I mean, sitting here today, I can't see it, but I know everybody will be hoping that it happens, and Provine will be optimistic, saying it is going to happen. But I don't think anybody's got the telescope to understand what's going to happen. But it just feels miles away from where we are right now. The people traveling from all over the world, literally every part of the globe, all getting into hotels and bars and restaurants. And I noticed that the place that organises Provine, not the organisers, but where the hall is, saying, well, you can use our Action Business Centre, but there can't be any parties. Well, that's not Provine that I know anyway. So I just can't see it sitting here right now. I really can't, but I hope I'm wrong.
Well, as we said before, I mean, if there was a health risk during a viral crisis, standing around in tightly knit, clustered, elbowing people out of the way to spit. As I said, slender, elegant.
I just don't see it. I just don't see it. But
one of two things has to happen. I think for anything like that to happen in the short, medium, long term, one of two things has to happen. Either we find a vaccine, and that is widely rolled out, or societally, worldwide, we come to an acceptance of risk that this is a horrible, horrible virus that some people are going to get and some people are going to get badly, and we tolerate a level of mortality that we can trade off against the economic benefits of keeping people out and about and doing things. I think it's unlikely that second scenario is going to come before the first. So really, we're waiting for a vaccine to be available for things like Provine to happen.
Yeah, Fergal, any other thoughts on?
Yeah, I realistically don't think anything like that will be happening within the next 12 months. And I'd still be 50-50 on the year after that, really, at the moment. So sadly, Vivian, won't see you in Dusseldorf next year, I think.
Well, I think part of it is a lot of companies, well, all companies have a duty of care over their employees, and in today's world of risk, and you know, I think it's going to be very difficult for boards to sanction activities that we've all been used to over the years. I really do, because it's potentially not good for the businesses concerned.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We've got people asking as well if you're all working from home. I mean, it looks like you are, apart from you, maybe, Troy.
No, this is my home.
Oh, you are.
He's famous for having a camp bed in his office, so that's an unfair question.
I thought I saw some office lights in the background, but I think it's just a reflection of the.
So yes, I'm in our office. We do have a warehouse, and just about everybody in the warehouse at a senior level is at risk. So I'm lucky enough to open, to close, to bring in the milk, to take out the trash. Yeah, so I'm the CEO/janitor at this stage, but you know, there's about 10% of the people that we normally have running around here, and yeah, so it's been an interesting few months on this side. And I think I think Andrew pointed out, it's really strange because the people that on the skeleton side that have been working, you know, the small team, they've never worked harder in their life.
Exactly.
The people furloughed, you know, some of them are having the time of their life. And now you bring a couple of the furloughed folks, the sales guy comes on, they're going to do what a sales guy does, start sending a bunch of emails to all the people that have been working, you know, super hard for 3 months. And it really has created conflict from, you know, the furloughed people and the people that have been working in the office. It's been a really interesting dynamic, but it's been a bit of a challenge for everybody, obviously. So yeah, I do come to the office because we have people here.
So what I was just wondering what percentage of staff are still furloughed, and what percentage is still back for everybody?
Well, 2/3 of the company had to be furloughed for us, but then hardly anyone is anymore because we've got the flexi system, which is great, particularly from a salesperson's point of view. I mean, salespeople's existence is about the amount of economic activity there is out there for them to sell to. So as soon as that disappeared overnight, they obviously had to go on furlough, but now that economic activity is coming back, they can come back commensurately. So that's changing all the time, and I imagine it is for others.
Yeah, we're using flexible furlough precisely for that, but also I think there's an element, going back to my previous point, of getting people back into the idea of working again. And you know, I think certainly my salespeople are you know, they're social creatures. They haven't enjoyed not being active. I mean, they might have done for the first week, but then I think the reality is bit, and so you know, we're certainly trying to get as many people involved, you know, to whatever extent we feel is possible.
But I would also like, around all this about working from home and how business is operating, I'd like to put a sort of shout out to London City Bond, who do our logistics, and people like that. I mean, we're a very small company, a small team. We have an office which I haven't visited for months, and I probably never will again. And we will probably quite happily work remotely for the foreseeable future. But if someone like an LCB or other logistics networks went down during lockdown, then a lot of businesses went down with them and couldn't operate. So I think that businesses like that have done a sterling job to keep the trade going for the sector as well, and allowed us to continue trading despite being, as I am, sat at home.
Okay. I think, great. Well, I think we'll take one more question, and then I was just going to ask for a quick sort of summary point from each of you, just aware of time and our hour is run. So we have a question. Will there be any permanent changes to how we should manage and analyze supply chain costs? Anyone want to pick that up?
Well,
Like direct, yeah. Troy.
Because we're vertically integrated, we own our own warehouse, and we've done, we have to do something different. If you're at LCB like Nick and or trade team like Michael, it might be a little bit different. You got a large fixed costs. We are, migrating a portion of the operation into B2C, completely different. It's a completely different pick. You got to bring the boxes to the people, not the people to the boxes. And so you have to set up, you have to structure, and we're trying to do it, and we're trying to do some fulfillment for some others to reduce the costs. So for us, as someone that's out there, and I think it was Fergal talking about it earlier, some of the service level and provisions of, not dropping every day, being smarter how you deliver, it's a big cost that everyone has to reduce a little bit. And we're trying to find ways, get the drop size right, get the vicinity correct, but we're trying to supplement with the B2C piece, which is helpful for us if we can keep the guys in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Fergal, what's same question, I guess, same topic, but to you.
I think for a few reasons, COVID related. It's difficult. I mean, we operate. I'm pretty much amazed every day when I wake up and see we get about 99.9% of our deliveries out and delivered next day from Scotland to everywhere in the country. So we do time deliveries into London from early in the morning the next day, and those trucks just leave us at 5 o'clock in the evening. That has we've managed to keep that for most of the time, except for the busy spikes. So most things have moved to kind of 2-day delivery. But yeah, those restrictions are going to stay, I think, until things fully normalize, and we've kept things flexible. I think everybody's doing the best they can. The guys in the warehouse equally have just been run off their feet, with some on furlough and gradually coming back now, which is great. I would say probably the other side of that question really is about the long-term viability, and there are a number of other things as well as Brexit coming, which is going to introduce an awful lot of uncertainty into supply chains for the next 12 months and cost. And things like the deposit return scheme on the horizon, which already in Scotland is another nightmare that I'm having on a recurrent nightmares. So I think there are a lot of challenges right across how we're going to manage all of that, and things will have to change because the margin isn't there at the moment to cope. So those costs are going to have to be passed on at some stage. And as I said, whether that's trying to work with people on reducing the number of deliveries, trying to keep minimum orders a little bit higher, and any of those things are going to be really important for the whole industry over the next 12 years if we're going to get through it all together. So I think there will need to be a number of changes across that. That's what I was saying earlier about the need to kind of maybe start working, not just talking at here within the wine trade, but trying to broaden the conversations out to look what we can do together, because there's quite a few things out of our control, but there's quite a lot that we can control and start working on now. And while the bigger conversations are going on, I think at the moment the pennies will also be very important. So yeah, both fronts.
That leads quite neatly, I think, into sort of beginning to wrap it up, and something, if there are some positive aspects that we can take out of this looking forward. So sort of in summary, really. So if I could perhaps just do the rounds and ask what aspects the panel feel we can take out of the current and ongoing crisis. So when we look back 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line, we can say, right, well, we actually rescued something out of this horrendous mess, and that has actually helped to make our businesses, our wine world, our drinks world, a better, more efficient, more sustainable place. Nick, I mean, do you want to kick off with any ideas?
There are 2 points to make. One is a wider point, which isn't restricted to the wine industry, and that is a better appreciation of how to lead our lives more efficiently, rather than necessarily having all to work in urban centres and travel vast distances and waste hours and hours of our weeks commuting. People are learning that they can work more efficiently, maybe digitally, and hopefully not all the time, of course, but predominantly. So I think that will inform all manners of society, whether that's where businesses are sited, but also ancillary businesses, whether that's the sandwich shop doing lunches, whether it's, as someone said earlier, you know, the person giving you your coffee when you arrive at the station at Waterloo in the morning and stuff like that. That will all look very different, I think, in 3 to 5 years' time. From the wine industry's point of view, I think that we will have a very different supply chain behind what people will be drinking and consuming, whether that's impacted by political economic decisions at a much higher level, Brexit, or God knows what's going to come in the next couple of years. It's probably going to surprise us. But whether it's that, or it's because there's consolidation in the industry, and the industry becomes more efficient in supplying. So I think that those are the two biggest things we're going to get out of this. Efficiency, really.
Efficiency. Troy, what thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with Nick. I think one of the challenges is going to be sort of the culture aspect of it. A lot of people are you know, taking the opportunity and they're going to walk away from pretty pricey real estate. A lot of people are pretty comfortable working from home. You know, but it's really hard, I think, to build a lot of that camaraderie and the culture that you're trying to get as a business if you can't have the people there access all the time. And I think that is going to be a difficult thing. Michael, you know, talked about the social aspect of, you know, our folks, but, you know, a lot of the salespeople are either nervous about going out or, you know, have family situations, elderly parents they take care of that are going to prevent them from doing so. So, but I do think this, you know, and maybe that's the next HR twist, is how to build the culture, you know, from a very remote standpoint. But I think that's going to be the difficult piece of trying to grow your business in a particular way with a decentralized workforce.
And Michael?
So, you know, can't argue with any of that, but you know, the reflection I have is that we've got, you know, basically the same number of suppliers chasing a much smaller cake right now. And I can't see the cake getting back to the size that it was for ages, if ever. So to me, inevitably, that's going to mean a contraction in our industry, which will mean you know, by definition, that will probably mean a consolidation of the number of suppliers in our industry. And you haven't really, I think Nick used the expression earlier on, you know, a lot of these things have been pushed down the road, the decisions, because of the government intervention. But in a low margin industry like we're in, you know, we're facing the day of reckoning much faster than I think, that many in the trade are facing into. And, you know, that's compounded by the other problems that I highlighted right at the start of this webinar, which, so I just don't see the state of play being the same in 18, 24 months time. But I've said that before and I've been proved absolutely wrong.
Let's just hope, Michael, that is the case this time. Although
well, I can't see how it can be, but that's
yeah, no, I fear that it's absolutely not going to be incorrect. And you know, the worst of the health crisis in the UK is possibly, hopefully, past. But the financial crisis, as you say, is currently being smoothed out, but now beginning to ramp up and emerge in a slightly frightening way. That's great. I think I'll stop there. It's been a really wide-ranging discussion. I'd like to thank all of the panel for your time and input, and also all the attendees. We've been pretty well attended today, so I hope everyone's had something of use to take away from the session. And we'll be posting it up, hosting it in Harpers, and also be doing a write-up for the print edition. So if anyone wants to re-catch up with it or share it with anyone, it will appear there. So, but otherwise, thank you very much all, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
See you.
Take care.
Cheers, guys.